Welcome, everyone. This is Adrienne Fisher with the National Conference of State Legislatures. I'm very excited that y'all were able to join us today because we have a very exciting speaker. We're going to be joined today by Dr. Sharon Lynn Kagan, who is a preeminent scholar in international comparative research in early education systems. She is a professor of early childhood and family policy and co-director of the National Center for Children and Families at Teachers College at Columbia University, as well as an adjunct professor at the Child Study Center at Yale University. She'll be presenting on the findings from her newest book, The Early Advantage 2, which is the second in a series funded by the Center on International Education Benchmarking at the National Center on Education and the Economy. Dr. Kagan and her team conducted extensive case studies of 6 high-performing countries with innovative approaches to early childhood education, and today she'll be discussing how that work can inform the way that we build the early education systems of the future here in the States. Before I turn things over to Dr. Kagan, I want to encourage everyone to make use of the chat box to type in any questions you have. We'll have some time after Dr. Kagan's presentation to address those questions, so go ahead and ask them as they come up, and then we'll revisit after the presentation. And without further ado, Dr. Kagan, take it away.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking you, Adrienne, and of course everybody at NCSL for the opportunity to present the results of what was a rather extensive and methodologically tight study of early childhood systems in leading countries around the world. For the presentation today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the rationale in part 1 for the study, the goals and methods in part 2, and then, as you can see, the bulk of the time will be spent on what the important findings were, as well as how we use those findings to address some of the challenges that we in America are facing with regard to providing services to young children and their families. I've labeled part 1, the real and inconvenient truths. It is this context that provided the rationale for the study. I'm assuming that everybody on this line understands that there are some very real accomplishments that our field has made. We have incredible advances in science, in neuroscience research, but also in data from economics and the social sciences that have taught us a lot about quality. We have incredible advances in policy, beginning with the all-important United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of 4.2, that for the first time in the history of the UN actually cite commitments to improving early childhood programs. Plus, indeed, we have unprecedented policy interests all over the United States. And as importantly, we have seen tremendous advances in practice. There is a great deal of work going on the workforce. I'm sure some of you are very involved in it. A great new invigorized focus on equity and also work on systems of early childhood. But having said that, there are also a trilogy of very inconvenient truths that I want to suggest we have, A, been telling ourselves, and B, in telling ourselves, they have contoured our approach to early childhood. I'd like to talk about some of these facts. I'd like to talk about some of the inconvenient presumptions and a little bit about our inconvenient context. With regard to the inconvenient facts, yes, we are increasing our investments dramatically within this country. But when you compare the United States, circled in red, with countries with whom we routinely compete, we see that our expenditure on pre-primary education as a percent of total government expenditure on education really falls in the mid to lower end of the countries that are cited. Please note that included in this repertoire of countries are Mexico, Brazil, as well as the Nordic countries who we would typically expect would be investing a lot of money. The second inconvenient fact is about quality. Yes, we have been doing a great deal, but lo and behold, here too, on criteria that are used internationally to assess the quality of early childhood provision, the United States falls really woefully in the middle of countries. Clearly, nowhere near our Nordic neighbors, better than some other countries, but clearly we have a long way to go in terms of quality. But perhaps most pernicious of all, when we look at equity, the United States falls very, very short. This chart shows the availability of preschools for families in countries around the world. And we see that disproportionately the United States underperforms other countries in terms of actually who has access to early childhood programs. So these facts, while they are true, we tend to cover over them and don't own up to them as much as this study suggests we should. But it's not just facts that are woefully inconvenient. We have some very inconvenient presumptions that counter the way we think about early childhood. For example, we know that it's the government's responsibility to fully fund ECEC, and yet at the same time we know in our hearts and heads that government alone, the United States government, will probably never be able to fund services for young children to the levels of quality and equity that we need and that children deserve. We also presume that the results of evaluations should contour all policy. That is indeed the rationale for much of our policy work. And yet, in our hearts and heads, we know that the data from these evaluation studies, even those that have very rigorous methodology, don't necessarily effectively measure what really matters and what we value in early childhood. And finally, and somewhat ironically, we lament that early childhood is not yet a profession, and yet we base our quests for more compensation, for a more improved workforce, predicated on the rationale of professionalism. So the presumptions that are guiding our policy efforts are not necessarily aligned with what we are doing. But perhaps even more inconvenient is the American context. Under the truth of democracy in this country, we know that we have a very partisan system of governance. Under the, quote, truth of freedom and justice, we know that slavery, Jim Crow, racism, sexism, and a host of other isms exist. And finally, under the truth of being a loving, caring nation, concerned about our children and honoring our families, that all we have to do is look at hardcore data and we see that the United States fails miserably. It is these three inconvenient truths, inconvenient facts, inconvenient presumptions, and an inconvenient context that provided the rationale for a comparative analysis. The National Center for Education and the Economy felt that it was really important to look at what other countries were doing and to try to learn from them. So to address these inconvenient truths, we launched an international comparative analysis of the best countries using the best scholars in those countries. We created a very rigorous quality study, and we have produced a slew of products that we hope will be useful for diverse audiences around the world. With regard to learning from the best countries, we used two criteria to help us determine best. One was the results on PISA, the International Comparative Analysis that ranks 50 countries in the world. And the second was from the Economist Intelligence Report that looks specifically at quality in early childhood education. When we cross-hatched those, we found that they fell into 9 cells On the horizontal axis, we've got the results from PISA, which is represented in the columns. And on the vertical axis, on the horizontal axis, we've got the results from The Economist. And you can see the countries that we had to choose from. For a variety of reasons, we chose South Korea, Finland, and England as performing very high on The Economist, or what the scholars in the world think constitute high quality. We chose Hong Kong and Singapore, as well as South Korea. There was an overlap on PISA. And we chose Australia, although it didn't fall in the high category on either, for reasons that will become apparent as I speak. In each of those countries, we chose a scholar to act as a principal investigator. We subcontracted a large amount of money to those scholars to collect data according to a common protocol and meeting common scientific validation standards. You may not recognize their pictures, but it represents Nirmala Rao from Hong Kong. I'm going from left to right. Colette Taylor, who unfortunately passed away during the course of this study, and to whose Fund for Indigenous Women in Australia, all economic proceeds from this entire effort are being directed. Next is Christina Kumpalainen from Finland, Woo Young Moon from from South Korea. I'm there in the background. Rebecca Bull is from Singapore, and Kathy Silva is from the United Kingdom. I take time to cite these scholars because I'm very proud of the entire team. These are all well-polished academic scholars who have worked in their own countries to influence major policies for children and families. The study was rigorous because it had a very clear design. It had very rich research questions that tried to look at not only what is going on, but why do these policies really come into existence? How are these countries similar, and how are they different? How are their services similar and different? The study was grounded in theory, a systems framework, a theory of change, and really looked at diverse outcomes, not only quality, but equity, sustainability, and the efficiency of the services. And finally, we designed what we feel is the most rigorous and solid data study that exists that compares early childhood systems in diverse countries. We used common informant types, a common protocol across all the countries, and indeed the entire process was validated at 3 points during the course of the study. In the final event, someone in each of the countries who had not been involved in the study read all of our work to make sure indeed that we were on target. So we're fairly confident of our findings. Actually, we're very confident of them up until December of 2017, which is when the data collection ended. A lot of policies have changed in these countries since then, and I will augment what is written by that in my narrative. Finally, there are a diverse array of useful products that are available on the NCEE website under Early Advantage. There are very detailed case studies. There are 2 volumes of cross-case analysis. There are facts at a glance. So if you hover on that website, you will find lots of interesting material. So getting to what I promised, the framing findings. There actually are 4. And when I first read these, you're probably going to say, so what's really new? But I would ask that you stay tuned because it's what is under this slide that is important. The first is the really big importance of context. The second is what we call multiple bests. The third is the importance of structures and systems. And the fourth, which is somewhat new, is really the importance of synergy. So let me begin with context. The countries that we selected, the 6, fell into actually 3 different categories. The Nordic countries represented by Finland. So in each case, Finland, I would say, is not representative of all the Nordic countries, but it certainly is more like Nordic countries than it is like those in the Asian category, which in this study were Hong Kong, Singapore and South Korea, or countries that had an Anglo, largely a British tradition in this study, which were England and Australia. These contexts are very different. They're very different in terms of their commitment to public funding, their commitment to public provision, the degree to which they do and do not monitor programs, the degree to which they do and do not collect child data. So let me give you just a couple examples. Finland puts a great deal of trust in its teachers. Although all the teachers do not have BAs, and I'll talk about that in more depth in a few moments, they are pretty well trained. Every classroom has someone who is trained in pedagogy and someone who is actually trained in health. And they do believe in a universal commitment to young children. And so as a result, there is a very wide array of public services. There also is very limited monitoring and accountability. Singapore is exactly the opposite. It has an incredible spirit of innovation. Its policy borrows from lots of different countries. It has expanded its services to young children very, very rapidly and actually has done a wonderful job of inventing adaptations to what is known well around the world to its context. Finally, Australia, and here's why we included it, more than any of the other countries, it has honored the diversity of its population with very intense commitments to the indigenous populations. And so we have a lot to learn from Australia regarding their respect for the culture and diversity. And this is manifest throughout its pedagogy, throughout its funding. It has a strong commitment to egalitarianism and social justice. So the action one is that if we're going to dispel some of our inconvenient truths, we've got to honor our context more. You know, in America, our strategy is, well, we pilot a study and we replicate it, we evaluate it, and yet we know because context is very different, it's very hard for us to replicate and scale programs to full service. And this results in some of the vast inequities that we have. So paying a lot more attention to our social context, and I'll speak about this as I discuss some of the recommendations of this study. But context matters, and it contours policy in very important and very different ways. The second finding is the importance of multiple bests. So what indeed do I really mean by that? Well, all of these countries do better than the United States in 4 areas, in terms of their pre- and perinatal services, in terms of their services to infants and toddlers, and in terms of their services to preschoolers, along with their focus on transitions. Everybody does more, and certainly at the pre- and perinatal and with infants and toddlers than we do. But the really interesting thing is that they all do it differently. In other words, if a country invests very, very heavily in pre- and perinatal as well as in family leave, often what they provide for infants and toddlers is less robust because children are often at home with their parents. So there are spillover effects among these, but each of the countries does things that are very, very differently. So here's a really good example. England has the most comprehensive system of data collection on the planet. Finland, on the other, simply does no data collection at all. It provides comprehensive funding irrespective of any kind of monitoring or accountability. In Singapore, with regard to how they approach early childhood, they have a very consolidated system of governance under a brand new agency called ECTA, the Early Childhood Development Authority. And yet, in South Korea, they don't have any consolidated governance. Half of their services are through child care, half are through education, and yet they managed to create a very interesting, high-quality approach despite that divided governance. funding varies dramatically in how they do it, with South Korea using demand-side funding, and actually Hong Kong using robust supply-side funding. So the point I'm making is that all of the countries address these 4 areas, but they all do it in very different ways, which means that we should feel as a country quite liberated to pursue multiple bests and multiple different kinds of service. We are not going to advance the care, education, and development of young children with one program. Doing pre-K alone is just not going to do it. Or doing one policy fad is not going to do it. It is this comprehensive provision across the board, these multiple bests, that make a very big difference in the nature and quality of services for young children. The finding is the importance of structures and systems. This study found that much like a strong building, a strong early childhood system rests on, in our case, 5 pillars, and within each of those pillars there are building blocks, and I'd like to walk you through these very briefly. The first pillar talks about very strong policy foundations. So what do we mean by that? Well, we found that in all of these countries, they had comparatively supportive, very stable, and very adaptive contexts. That means we didn't find high-quality early childhood programs in governments where there was a recent coup or incredible, unpleasant policy turnover, and by that I mean where government services are massively disrupted. We also found that there needed to be ideological and fiscal support for early childhood, considered broadly from the population at large. The second thing we found about strong policy foundations that is distinctly unlike the United States is that these countries have policies that transcend individual programs, and they apply them consistently. They are simply appalled when they say we've got one set of regulations for Head Start programs and another set of regulations for pre-K and another set of regulations for child care. They wouldn't think of that. They have common national policy frameworks. They have common pedagogical frameworks. And so it doesn't really matter where the funding comes from because they fall under the rubric of a common policy foundation. And finally, the third building block in this pillar is that these countries do a much better and much more deliberate job of engaging stakeholders, constituents, and the public. We'll have examples of this as we go forward, but what is really important, we spend a lot of time engaging parents in programs. We take a programmatic approach. These countries do that, but they also take a systemic approach and engage policymakers, business leaders, foundation leaders in the broad design of what early childhood services will look like from a national, and in some states like Australia, a sub-national perspective. The second pillar says that these countries all provide comprehensive services. I alluded to that. They have very inventive approaches to funding and very inventive approaches to governance. So let me unpack that one. We in this country spend a lot of time debating, well, is it comprehensive early development? Is early childhood including health? Is it including infant and toddler? These countries have gotten over that. They understand that there are 2 things we're talking about. One is comprehensive early development that includes health, mental health, social welfare, social support services, and embraces all children birth to age 8. They also know that early childhood care and education is a subsector of that, and that subsector, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. I've got a call coming in on my cell, and I'm just not going to take it. But anyway, so that subsector is part of CED, but it focuses on the services that young children receive when they are in family child care or in center-based settings. That is really important. They have sufficient funding for baseline services, and many of them provide what they call progressive universalism, which is layered on top of universal basic services. They provide very intense services for families that need them most. Very few of the countries are relying fully on the public sector for full provision of services to young children. I want to make this point very loud and clear. Even Finland, where we know has a very, very social welfare orientation and invests a great deal of money in services for young children, they ask parents who can to make contributions to those services. In Singapore, no matter how rich or how poor a family is, everybody contributes to early childhood, even if it is the equivalent of $1 a month, because Singaporeans believe that if you invest in the service, you will be involved in it. Finally, with regard to coordinating mechanisms of governance, I alluded to this, that I went into this study thinking that we had to have a centralized governance system, a little bit like ECTA in Singapore or like the Massachusetts Department of Early Care and Early Learning. And what we found is that many countries retain divided governance structures at the national and some even at the subnational, which would be equivalent to our states. But they do have those transcendent policies, that's why that was Pillar 1, that apply across all the programs that indeed render them comparable, provide equitable access to them, and render them of comparatively higher quality than what we are doing. So it's very interesting to learn about different approaches to certainly funding and governance. The third pillar, very predictable, is about knowledgeable and supported families and teachers. And I think you may find some of this rather surprising. They all have well-prepared, better compensated, and respected workforces than the United States does. Having said that, when asked about the weakness in their systems, each one of the principal investigators says that we're not doing enough on teachers and families. But let me share a little bit about what they are doing that might be really interesting to you. A large number of the countries have established common professional titles. So in Australia, there are 4 titles. No matter where you work in an early childhood program, you fall into one of those 4 categories. There is fairly common job descriptions. There are fairly common entry requirements. So it doesn't matter what the program is, not the unit of analysis. The society is the unit of analysis. They have very common licensure requirements, but interestingly, they have competency frameworks, and they are not conceptualizing competencies as distinct from formal BA or AA level training, but they are conceptualizing them as alternative pathways. There is a very detailed description of this in Book 2 of The Early Advantage, and I would call your attention to look at the career pathways that Singapore uses, because in my mind is the most inventive combination of a competency and degree-based platform. Finally, these countries deploy their staff inventively. Sometimes they alter their ratios depending on the degree of training. A professional teacher may end up with more children in her classroom. They alter the ratios depending on the ages of the children. They also accordion the ratios so that at some points during the day when children are doing activities that demand more intense support from teachers, the groups will be smaller. At other times they are larger. So they use what they refer to as accordion staffing as well as differentiated staffing. In addition, all of these countries put a lot of focus on not only pedagogical leadership, but on administrative and policy leadership. So they are training people not just to be educational leaders in the programs, but they are training people to be administrative leaders and policy leaders. I'd like to know what Finland does. The highest ranking person in Finland centers has the title of, I believe it's consistent with being an educational coordinator, but that person is really trained in instructional diagnosis and in working with teachers to plan programs. In several of the centers that I visited, these individuals were all what we would call the equivalent of special ed training. So they rely on those educational leaders to guide individual diagnoses. They also, every single child has an individualized education plan in Finland where their diagnosis as well as their needs and the plans the teachers and parents co-construct for the children have. Which leads me to the last point, that they don't see, and we debated this a long time, most of these countries see families as so integral to the learning process. They do a great deal to engage their families. They do a great deal to make families more knowledgeable and see it as part and parcel of their responsibility to do parent engagement and parenting education. It is part of what they connote as early childhood. The fourth pillar, and I've alluded to this a little bit, is informed, individualized, and continuous pedagogy. So when we talk about the pedagogy of these countries, all of them espouse child-centered, play-based, and holistic pedagogies. And all of them have national frameworks that have been developed and that are used throughout the countries. Having said that, I visited programs in each of these countries, high quality. They look as different as day and night. You would never mistake high quality in Finland, a high quality program, for a high quality program in Hong Kong or in Singapore. They look very, very different, both achieving high quality according to their context. And here we return back to that first principle. The second point is that they all individualize very, very well for young children. And they do that individualization by honoring children's developmental needs, but also their cultural and their family needs. And in most of the countries, despite the existence of these national curriculum, they allow teachers to make choices regarding what they're going to teach and when they're going to teach. And I use the word teach in quotes. What I really mean is to present as learning and engagement opportunities for children. They do individualize. And finally, they all do a much better job of providing for transitions or continuity in children's experiences. Each one of the countries has a whole portfolio. Many of them create transition plans for individual children. So they attend at an individual level for continuity, but then they also attend at a system level for continuity because they align their policies and their programs across the ECE system and beyond into primary school. Finally, the fifth pillar, and this might surprise you, is that all these countries, with the exception of Finland actually, do a much more comprehensive approach to collecting and using data for improvement. Many of the countries actually, although they have resisted collecting child data at the national level, now do so. The best exemplar of that, and again I point you to an explication of the narrative in the book, is England. They all collect formative data on young children and they collect data for planning. Some of them do it very regularly, some do it more spontaneously. But the national data sets on children are very productive. England does it when children are 2, and they do it again as they move into primary school. And the data that they collect as they are making that move are all transported with the children into the primary setting. They all have very effective monitoring systems that collect and use program data, but they have consistency. So there is one program monitoring standard that exists, and all the programs, despite where and how they're funded, are evaluated against that monitoring system. Also, they feel no compunction about publicizing the results to help parents make informed choices. In several of the countries, these data are available online, and in England, for example, they feel that putting them online has really helped improve the quality of programs. And finally, each one of the countries does a far better job of producing and using research. They all have research centers that are devoted to early childhood. They regard it as a legitimate domain of inquiry. South Korea is a wonderful example. After the Korean War, when it established its successive 5-year plans, and they do abide by those 5-year plans, they realized they needed to have data on which to do subsequent planning. And so right at the very beginning, they established a research institute to collect data on young children and to inform young children and on their programs to inform the policies that are being made. So what does this all say? This all says that we in America have been very focused on improving practice and improving programs. And indeed, that is notable and it's worthwhile. But that alone is not going to forge the kind of quality and the kind of equity, the kind of consistency and continuity that indeed we need. We need a much more strategic approach to systems and to systems thinking and to systems planning. So let me give you a couple of examples, and it finds itself in the fourth finding, which is the importance of synergy. These countries are different. They don't all focus on exactly the same thing. England does a far better job on child data and monitoring than other countries. Other countries may do a better job on workforce or on governance. But what is interesting is that what they do that we don't do is they develop something and they use it to create change in other building blocks. So let me give you an example. I talked about pedagogy and the national curriculum. Well, it's not just that they have a national framework for early childhood, but they use that national framework then to create the criteria for what the workforce should be. If we know what we want for children, then we know what we need for teachers. They use it to frame engagements for families. They use the national framework as the basis for collecting data on children and data on programs. And in some countries, they actually use it as a basis for funding. If you indeed implement the national framework well, you will get additional funding. I think you can see my point. It's not just that there is a national framework, but the national framework influences all these other policy efforts. It's not like they are created in separate silos. So understanding these linkages ends up being very, very important. Given that America is so concerned about the workforce, let me talk a little bit about the workforce. In many of these countries, there are common workforce criteria, both for levels of performance and for inauguration into the field. They use that workforce data to advance leadership. Singapore's ladder I mentioned before has the leadership track built right into it. But they predicate all of that workforce development on the pedagogical framework, on funding. They use it to fund all kinds of strategies. The book is loaded with inventive approaches to funding scholarship and training programs. And they understand that there is a workforce challenge, and so they are using their governance structures to prioritize workforce. I hope you get the gist of what I'm suggesting, is it's not just that documents exist, but they have life and they are used to propel changes in other areas, in other building blocks. So we need to strategize for synergy. I don't think America does this very well. I think we strategize for an individual program or for maybe, a building block, but we don't really think interactively about how all of these are related. So what does this really mean? Where do we go from here as Americans living in very, very different states in very different contexts? Julius Richmond, who was the former Surgeon General of the United States, the founder of Head Start, had a very simple formula if you really want social change. And I contend that's what early childhood education in America is about. If you think back 50 years when all we did was, quote, babysit, to where we are today, you will see that we have made great social changes. So Julie says that you need a knowledge base, and I would contend that we've got a pretty good knowledge base. No, it's not perfect, but it is very strong. Public will, I would contend we've got growing public will. We're not there yet. We need more. But I would suggest to you that where we are the weakest is on our overall social strategy, and those are the lessons from the early advantage. So if we focus on social strategy, that third elixir for social reform, what does it mean? I think it means that we've got to acknowledge our inconvenient truths or the conventional ways we thought and really take them to task. Second, I think it means we have to draw lessons from around the globe. And third, I think it means that we've got to really begin to act anew. So what are the lessons from around the globe? One, these study countries are doing well. Obviously, we picked them because they were doing well. But they are all doing well differently, and that's important to remember. It is also important to remember that the study countries face common challenges and that none of the countries is exactly where it would ideally like to be. Each country learned from the other countries in the process of our study. With regard to strategies for tomorrow, I would like to suggest that there are a number of them, and I'm going to just focus on a few, and we can talk more. I think my time is running low, so let me move forward. I want to suggest that we need to really adopt this approach to multiple bests. We need to understand that there is not one approach to governance that works. That from these countries, there are different approaches to governance, and we need to design our system so that even if we have different structures at the state level, we do have allied, if not exactly comparable frameworks, regulations, standards for professional development. And that is a very significant takeaway. By the way, none of these is easy to achieve. The second is synergies. I do believe that we are very weak on our data systems, and that the United States at the state level really needs to invest money in both collecting important data on children and using that data to drive policy. Data ends up being, and this is the knowledge base that Julie talked about, it ends up being the fundamental rock on which new policies exist. And in many of our states, we have got very, very limited efforts at data collection, particularly around children and around the quality of our early childhood systems. I think we do a better job on programs, but on children and systems, not so good. I think we've got to be far more inventive about our workforce. I know lots of folks are putting a lot of time and energy into it. We've got to develop career ladders that specify common titles and common qualifications. And NAYC is doing a lot of work in this area. We need to pay attention to it, and it needs to pay attention to some of the work that's going on internationally. I think we've got to think far more about competencies as an avenue, if indeed we want to maintain the diversity of our workforce, a workforce that needs to be diverse to match the incoming diversity of young children in our programs. We've got to be quite inventive about competencies that indeed can lead to qualifications and lead to certifications. And finally, I think we're far too calcified in our ratios and in our approach to ratios in this country, and thinking about flexibilities regarding the deployment of those ratios is an important strategy for us to consider. Finally, I do think that national frameworks are very important, particularly when they are used in the synergistic way that these countries use them. And everyone says, but we're so different, we can never have a national framework. The reason Australia was in this study is because it has a more decentralized approach to governance than we do in the United States. Its states and territories have far more authority legally than our states do. And yet it created a national framework. It created a national quality assurance strategy. States or territories were free to adapt the national strategy, but essentially a national strategy did exist. So it can be done. There are models around the country. And I want to suggest that I hope in this presentation you have gotten that there are a lot of truths that are quite inconvenient and perhaps not true that should focus to draw lessons from countries around the globe who are tackling with strategies in ways that are indeed enable us at least to look to see if we can improve our own strategies. But I would suggest, if this study tells us anything, it tells us that we've really got to be thinking far more freshly than we have in the past. And so with that, I think I will conclude here and just say that I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, and I do believe that we have time for questions. I would be more than delighted to answer them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kagan. We appreciate you taking the time with us today. I'm going to open it up to questions if you guys want to take a minute to think about them. Oh, already. Dr. Kagan, can you see that question, or do you need me to read it?
I'd like you to read it, please.
Sure, no problem. In countries where language and developmental diversity is wide, it is sometimes perceived that efforts at providing a homogeneous response to the education needs will always be frustrated, as the more developmentally challenged areas will hold back the more advanced. In my country, Nigeria, an international participant, this problem has persisted and is a major challenge with regulation and framing a curriculum that is contemporary. What potential strategies or global reference countries would you recommend?
Outstanding question. Thank you. I would suggest that people look at the framework in Australia, because more than any other country, I think they have done a wonderful job of two things. Number one, dealing with their own indigenous population, but two, Australia, many countries are migrating or sending migrants to Australia. And so they have got population influxes and are dealing with them dramatically. I do want to say one thing that was very surprising to me. In most of the countries that I visited where there were large numbers of immigrant children, I expected to see a lot more language diversity. I expected to see programs and services like our bilingual education programs. And actually, in many of the countries, not all, but in many of the countries, there is a desire to get children to a standard in the language of the predominant culture, so that they rely on parents, they engage parents very, very heavily, but home language is used in the home until the children actually learn the dominant language. This is true in Finland. It is true in Hong Kong. The goal of bilingualism remains a goal. They are not hoping the children will lose their one language, but the socialization is to the dominant language of the country. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much. I actually have a very kind of basic question that I realize might not have an easy answer, but I'm just curious. For these 6 study countries, how long more or less have these systems been in place? Like, how long have they been in development with the systems that we have now recognizedly?
Outstanding. I had thought that most of them were developed for many, many, many years, and that part of our challenge was because we were newer. And actually, little could be further from the truth. Post-World War II, Finland actually embarked on its existence as a social welfare state and looked to serve young children as a part of that. But we're talking about late 40s, early 50s. Similarly, England, while it had services embryonically, also expanded almost as a pronatalist, a response to repopulating the country following the war. Perhaps the most stunning example is Singapore. Singapore's commitment to young children is comparatively new, really new, probably within the last 20 years. So we are talking about countries in general with fairly recent commitments to early childhood, countries that are more advantaged in some cases than we because of their social welfare orientation to expend in this area. But nonetheless, the histories are not long, and America's history is not that much different from many of these countries.
Great. Thank you so much. We did have another question come in. Could you talk about any U.S. states, if there are any, that are using some of the international approaches you covered today?
That's a really excellent question. And I would say that if I went to each state and conducted a study similar to this, because in many cases the countries were the size of our states, we would find interesting things going on. We would find similar things. The points that I tried to make in this are where our distinctions are, notably that we don't think synergistically and that we don't think across the board. Now, you all know that 5 or 10 years ago we had states with 3 and 4 sets of early learning standards, and now most states have consolidated those down into one set, or at most 2, one for the state and one for Head Start. So I think there are examples of this happening. Certainly on the governance, we have got consolidated governance happening in a number of states around the country. We've got some very good examples of inventive funding strategies that are happening more in localities than necessarily at the state level. So there are examples, but in truth, I don't think that I would find the ideology that is A, embedded in context, B, that is embedded in this commitment of universality in many of the states in the country, which is why I hope the study will be potent. And if you know of them, I would really love you to let me know.
Thank you. One of the things that you touched on was the importance of pursuing multiple bests rather than attempting to advance one policy or program design that's sort of a fad, as you called it. And I think one of the things that we see on the state level is that there will be program designs that are performing very well in a state or in certain localities, and like you said, what we want to do when we see that is to replicate them. So how can we expand those kinds of high-quality programs without running into some of those pitfalls that we see sometimes in scaling up efforts?
So I want to suggest that the unit of analysis when we are focusing on programs is kind of what the problem is. If you take a look, do I have the capacity to go back to the pillar slide? Yeah. Do I have the capacity to do that? Okay, great. So if you take a look at what we are saying and what these countries believe is essential to their quality, it really has nothing to do with an individual program in there. It's not that there's a model of a universal pre-K or that there's a model of a parenting education program that works best. America is in love with programs. These countries are in love with the infrastructure. They understand that the only way you're going to get quality in the programs is if you focus on workforce, if you focus on leadership, if you focus on funding and governance. So I would suggest that the units of analysis need to be these building blocks that until we get better child data, for example, we're going to have a very, very hard time convincing policymakers of needs. And that if we focused on child data, or if we focused on leadership, or if we focused on engagement, those are the strategies, the areas of intentionality, as opposed to trying to replicate yet one more program. It's quite a distinct difference, and I hope I'm making it clear. Please press me if I'm not.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. We get a lot of questions, I think, from state policymakers who are wanting to improve quality in their states and feel like they have a lot of good programming, and I think it's interesting to have that perspective of we need to think beyond just programs.
Exactly. That if there's a message from this study, it is indeed that we're never, it's sort of like we're planting a million flowers, a million different programs, and we're making each one look beautiful, and yet we're not nourishing the soil in which they grow, the infrastructure or these building blocks. Excuse the mixed metaphor, but I think you get what I mean. You know, we're planting thousands of flowers, but without nourishing the soil or providing rain or sun, those flowers are dying. And I want to suggest to you, if you go back to the data that I showed at the beginning, we're putting in a lot of money, but we're not doing a really good job on quality, and we're doing a far less good job on equity. And so we've got to jigger our thinking, and along with that, our investments to focus on these building blocks or these infrastructural elements.
Well, Dr. Kagan, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your work with us. And to everyone who joined us, we'll be sending out resources, including a video of the webinar if you want to share it with any of your colleagues. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us here at NCSL, and we'll see you on the next webinar.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.